Well, we are again fortunate to have Mr. Wes Pendergrass with us. Wes is, as you know, is a visual designer, consultant, instructor, adjudicator within the marching arts. Original home is Mountain Home, Arkansas. An academic background in physical education, music performance. Again, he works in the drum corps, marching band activity. His company is called Shoeless Designs. And I was in New Orleans, as some of you were, doing a presentation a few years back. And I had the good fortune of coming, my presentation was right after Wes's, and my jaw was on the ground actually just listening to his presentation. So I mean, no pressure there, Wes, but he really, he's terrific, and I think we're going to get a lot out of it. So welcome, Wes.
Thank you guys so much. This is definitely one of those things where you look at the room and definitely know that you're the most underqualified person to be speaking on a subject like this. So feel free to take me off the rails as much as possible, and we'll just we'll go with the flow. And I have a presentation I'll give. We can start, stop, we can move, we can change directions as much as we want to, little as we need. If I just get a thumbs up from literally anybody, probably Meredith or somebody. You guys can see my screen, I assume. All right, so this is overall design. The thesis of this is basically, hey, I'm not the audio guy, and you're about to listen to probably the greatest visual designer of all time in the next session, and that is not me, obviously. Jeff has won a championship in literally every single marching arts idiom. So I'm going to be broad. I'm going to talk in a few directions. The primary focus of my conversations today is what is difficulty in indoor, and reframing maybe how we look at that space and what we find as difficult or not difficult within that space. This is that awkward prerequisite slide where I just talk about myself just a little bit. It'll make me super uncomfortable, but we'll wax through it and then we'll try to get silly afterwards. Like Wayne said, I'm a professional draw writer and visual designer. I did outside of this space as well. I did the Olympics in Japan. I've done some Super Bowl halftimes and do shareholders meetings, stuff like that. Was a tuba player, did the orchestral thing in Mexico and was terrible at it and did not enjoy it and decided to come back to the United States and try something else. So I became a lumberjack model and then slowly transitioned into event spaces and marching band staging and arranging performers in spaces of a variety of different artistic endeavors. 10-year drum corps vet, 8-year drum corps instructor, 9-time WGI champion, active in-person educator, and obsessed with college. I'm going back right now to try to get a doctorate in exercise science and kinesiology from Temple University, and I'm currently ABD, so we'll see. That said, here's your disclaimer. I'm an idiot. So as we talk through all this stuff, if you don't agree with it, seems odd, it seems counterintuitive to other information you've received or you've heard, yes, that's probably true. You should trust your gut. In general, I suffer from foot in mouth disease pretty bad. And so I'll probably do that 5 to 10 times in a presentation like this. And obviously, this is just my impressions from a very short career in a very, very young activity, which is one of the things that motivated me into creating a presentation like this. Because it's such a new activity, because we're still growing in terms of units, our adjudication field is largely populated by the best and brightest in other marching arts idioms. And so as we start to spend more time in that arena, we're starting to discover what's actually difficult for performers and the designers within that idiom to do, and that's the primary thesis of the conversation. So the table of idiotic outlooks is this. We're going to talk about the space. We're going to talk about our interpretation musically of what's difficult and what's easy in terms of the composition. Same thing visually, and then the audio, the big elephant in the WGI wins room that lots of people have lots of opinions on, and we just got out of a session about that as well. So one of the things about the space that is the most jarring when we actually really think about it, and once we understand the space more intimately with a really easy to understand parallel, it will drastically change how we think about difficulty in both the composition and the execution of the composition with performers. On that front, a mental picture is worth 1,000 words, and I found a terrible Google image picture of the dirtiest band room on Google. Kind of hard to see it pixelated. But NAFME, the Association of Colleges of Schools of Architecture, they have created the guidelines for what you think a typical band room is. The typical band room has about 20 to 50 square feet per instrumentalist. So if you've seen a band room that looks appropriately sized for an ensemble, you have seen something that fits within those guidelines. The shocking thing about that is that if you sit down and you do math, and you take out the super small ensembles, like the 6-member ensembles and the 81-person world-class ensemble from Indiana, if you take those out, then most of the time, you are actually looking at a space that is similar in size and nature to a band room. So what this means is that practically, the band room space is similar almost always to the indoor space, minus those little extreme ends of the spectrum, which will probably eventually lead to some sort of cap on performer participation. But things that are difficult in wind band are difficult in indoor winds, and marching band things lesser so. So when we sample this indoor idiom, because most of our backgrounds are fantastic and mostly involve the outdoor arts, we need to reframe how we look at that space and how we look at what's difficult and what's easy within that space. So how does the band room influence difficulty in design execution for performers? Basically, musically, they are reversed of what they are visually. So if you're looking at a beginner ensemble, they're usually using a smaller than expected band space. So if the amount of floor or space that they typically consume would look small in a band room, you'd be like, man, they need a bigger band room. You're typically looking at a beginner musical ensemble. If it's about appropriate for the size of a band room, you're looking at an intermediate ensemble. And if it's larger than the expected space, removing our outliers, some people can't have a larger than the expected space, then we're probably looking at something that is trying to be advanced musically. Visually, one of the interesting things about this activity is that because it's basically marching band in a band room, if you really think about the dynamics of those spaces, then if it is larger than what is musically comfortable, it is usually easier visually because we have removed a lot of difficulty in density. If it's the expected size of the space, it's probably fairly intermediate. And the smaller the space that the performers operate in visually, the more difficult it becomes, which is a little bit counterintuitive relative to the marching arts outside. But as we start to go through some of the other points and textures and ideas and densities and stuff like that, that will make more sense. Something I will talk a lot about is texture and the multiplicity of texture. Basically, any visual composition becomes more intriguing, or at least more ideas can be covered, the more compositional elements that are added. One of the things that made some of the Rothko paintings so powerful in the middle of the 19th century was that there was very little there in terms of the composition. But in general, the more textures that you have, the more visual or musical ideas that you have that occur at the same time, the more things that can be covered musically and visually. This also gives us a great opportunity to arrive at tension and release. So when we talk about multiple textures musically, we're talking about something beyond melody, a single melody and a single harmonic idea. When we talk about visual textures, we're talking about something more than a single formal visual texture when we're marching, or a formal density relationship if we're in movement. Anytime we start to add more of those elements, we're probably starting to sample into something that is no longer a beginning or basic skill, and difficulty becomes more perceivable in those situations. So let's talk about the music. So I've tried to grab as many cringy pictures as I can. This is the music education cringe picture of all time. And ensemble, schmonsemble. So one of the biggest things that we'll notice right off of the bat about the space as we've defined it, being really kind of smaller than you would imagine, is that we're in a gym and we're in a small space. Volume is the easiest situation to create. So the value of volume is not the same value as it would be in the outdoor idiom. I could stand in a gym right now and scream at the top of my lungs, and you would say to me, "That is loud, please stop it." I am only a single person. Volume is the easiest situation to create. So volume is also something that is hard to reward to the same extent. Also, the space, as Aaron was talking about previously, the space tends to be awash of acoustics at times, and it decreases the effective use of sampling as an adjudicated tenant. So if we're listening to full ensemble playing, at a nice, broad, dynamic effort, then what we're actually getting is we're getting something that makes it harder for the individual adjudicator to perceive individuals and or what's going on as the ensemble plays in a full ensemble moment. The other thing about that space, because it's small, because it's intimate, because volume is easy, and because the acoustics are kind of scary, what becomes more difficult is multiple musical textures, because it's hard to manage the balance, blend, and sonority of those. And it's really, really hard to be able to do it in this gym, in this gym, in this arena, in this gym, and in this arena. The other thing that we'll notice is that in indoor in particular, vacancy in small groups of performers are sometimes the only and the easiest way to sample the musicians and their relationship to excellence and what's going on. It's also one of the rare opportunities to get relief. Volume is easy. The other thing, and I actually tried this just to make sure I'm not crazy, vertical timing is not as difficult as we assume it is. So rewarding vertical timing is not as inherently meaningful as it would be in the outdoor idiom. If I took a brass quintet and I spread them to four corners of a band room and I put a performer in the center and I clap them off together, they are a lot more likely to be close to vertical time than a snare drum on the front sideline and a snare drum on the back hash. That's almost an eighth note apart. And in the band room that I tried this in, it's only really about a 16th note apart. So the vertical reward that we're starting to find musically doesn't necessarily make sense with what's actually difficult in the space. So what does that look like in terms of value? If something that we're witnessing musically is mostly singular texture, so it has a harmonic idea and a melodic idea and very little else, it's probably a beginner skill or a beginner ensemble and a beginner composition. If we're starting to get more text on top of that, so we're getting a melodic idea, a counter idea, something ostinato, and a harmonic idea, then we're starting to look at more of an intermediate skill. And then if it's mostly multiple textures outside of the bigger rivals, you are looking at something that is incredibly advanced for the idiom and for the space, because they have basically chosen to do the hardest thing almost always, which is not full ensemble volume playing. In terms of how much ensemble, and I'm using ensemble in the guard sense here. Ensemble is we are all participating in a very similar way in the similar roles and similar responsibilities through space and time. Musically, it's almost always ensemble if it's a beginner skill. In terms of intermediate skills and intermediate units and compositions, there's some diversity in choirs and solos. And then honestly, once we start to get into really, really advanced units and compositions, it's seldom ensemble outside of these really big, impactful moments that require that unity and relief from all of the different textures that we've seen. In terms of extreme dynamics, we already know what's easiest. So if it's loud frequently, it's probably a beginning ensemble or a beginning composition. If it explores some lower dynamics, then it's probably intermediate. And honestly, when it displays moments of extreme loudness that jar you, that seem nonsensical relative to what we think is loud in the space, and lots of extreme quietness, you're probably looking at an advanced composition and an advanced ensemble. So the visual, it can't have the same responsibilities as marching band, and there are several reasons why it can't have that. And primarily is that we've removed the visual support. So we have taken away a lot of the things that we rely on in other idioms to support an ensemble visually. We have taken that away, which means that vertically and horizontally, there's not as much that can be covered unless the wind musicians end up doing more. Something that's a really impactful cornerstone of WGI Winds is that the value is 50% in terms of how it is provided. So visually, there is a reward for making sure we're covering what's going audiologically throughout the program. And it is a more rewarded thing than it would be in the outdoor idioms. So the accountability must change in that regard. Openness and broadness is comfortable. We talked about the space before. Since the space is inherently already smaller, it's already starting from a place of being uncomfortable. The more space that a unit occupies, the more comfortable it is for the performers visually. Density is very uncomfortable, especially in the type of space that a lot of these indoor units are using. A lot of them are now using, they're using a 5-foot grid. And so those performers are literally 1.3 steps apart in major parts of their program. That difficulty is inherent and growing over time. Multiple textures reveal more accurate representation of what each kid and each student and each unit performer can do individually. And it's also a really great way to cover multiple musical ideas. Bruce has given us a striptease. I've loved it the whole time here. Body skills that require sustained dynamic ranges of effort, manipulation of the instrument, the kinesphere, and getting into the ground are requisite skills. That is a lot of stuff. So I did a couple surveys where I sent, I put a post in the WGI Facebook group chat about WINS, asking some questions, and then I put one in the WINS instructors and designers page, asking some questions like, what do you think inherently needs to be discussed or needs to have more value conversations? And body skills were the number one thing. So everybody wanted to talk about those body skills. By dynamic ranges of effort, we mean anytime the body succinctly moves in a different direction at a different speed. By sustain, we're talking about the use of the body moving slowly through space and time relative to the soundtrack. Manipulation of the instrument in the kinesphere is anything that the instrument actually is involved in the band body with. So think gesturing less with the lower body and everything traveling with the performer's upper body and the instrument as well. And getting into and out of the ground and being vertically elevated are really, really skills that don't necessarily seem to get rewarded as much because we don't understand their inherent need and nature within the idiom yet. And then the other thing that kind of needs to be realized to a certain extent is that marching is mostly a singular effect. So in the outdoor idiom, marching is used as a way to facilitate traveling from one part of the space to the other to set up a new visual idea, often supported by the color guard. What we need to remember in this idiom, however, is that every performer is only 8 to 16 counts away from any position in the floor. So marching is not necessarily something that facilitates the ability to get those variety of effects. We can move there. We can do a blending of ideas in terms of movement and marching at the same time, but just marching and playing is not something that necessarily has a value reward beyond its singular effect as marching or marching and playing. So if we look at that, it's similar to the graphs for the music. For mostly single texture, you're looking at something that is a beginner composition or a beginner unit with skills, beginner skills rather. Then we go into intermediate, and if it's mostly multiple textures outside of arrivals, we're looking at something that's pretty advanced for the idiom. Density, if it is rarely dense, it is very probably beginner in terms of the skill being represented. If it displays some density, specifically in musically impactful moments, it's probably an intermediate idea. And if it's very dense yet readable, that is an incredibly, incredibly advanced skill for the idiom because it's basically like boxing in a phone booth at this point. We have a lot of performers on the floor with a lot of units that are occupying very small spaces and doing really incredible things in terms of readability. And that is an advanced skill easily. Movement, there's some long-winded terminology in this, but it's similar to what we talked about. If there's little to no body, or what body they do have is everyone does it at the same time. It's angular and lacks sustain. It's probably a beginning effort. If the body is almost always covering what's going on in terms of the soundtrack, and it displays some skills occasionally that travel into space or into and out of the ground, that's an intermediate skill. And then honestly, once you can't tell if it's marching or movement, the performers get into and out of the ground all the time. The instruments travel through the kinesphere and face a bunch of different places and stuff like that. We're looking at an advanced skill in terms of what's going on movement-wise. And then the last point that we were going to talk about was electronics. So what's really going on back there or up front if they're super brave? Trying to get out of the minutia of being very, very specific, like we tend to find ourselves in these sessions. I wanted to focus on broad things that we can pay attention to understand whether or not the composition and the interaction of the coordinated elements of the electronic relative to the wind score is beginner, intermediate, hard. I wanted to focus on just finding those easy to read things to understand that value. If the time is mostly initiated and continued by the rhythm performers, you're probably looking at a very basic soundtrack or rhythm section. And I wanted to make sure that we're thinking of it as track or rhythm because we do tend to have some rhythm sections still. If some time is initiated or controlled from the floor, it's starting to become more difficult. And then if we have lots of stops and starts in the track or time is handed off from elements on the floor to elements in the electronics, and it goes back and forth frequently, we're looking at something that's probably pretty advanced in terms of the composition. The next one would be differences. So we often spend a lot of time talking about how to enhance the soundtrack to enhance what's going on with the winds. But the reality is, in our space, acoustically, because of what's going on, the more similar the electronics are to the wind composition, the harder it makes the wind composition to read and therefore value. So if the soundtrack is rarely different than the wind score and shares a lot of similar timbres and harmonies and melodies and time, then it's probably a beginning unit because they're not exposing the value that they have musically from performer to performer, and they're protecting the sonority of the ensemble with what's going on from the back of the floor or the front of the floor. If the track starts to vary away and add sophistication and presentation, multiplicity of timbres and textures, other harmonic or melodic ideas, we're probably looking at something that is considered a more intermediate skill. And if the soundtrack is various in timbre and various in dynamic ranges and melodic ideas and composition, then we're probably looking at an advanced skill. And why would the soundtrack dictate that in that way? We're not necessarily inherently valuing the soundtrack more. We're valuing what that soundtrack provides, which is the opportunity to sample winds more easily because of the difference in timbre, and also because of the next line, which is vacancy. If the track and rhythm section is rarely absent from the performance or it rarely goes away, that's a huge safety net for that ensemble. They are sitting in that every single second of the program. We're looking at a basic composition and a basic performance of skills. If the wind track goes away in some moments, we're allowing some exposure to that vacancy, so it's easier to sample those wind musicians. And we're also adding more variety musically and in terms of the musical textures we're hearing. That's probably an intermediate skill. And if the track is very various and super present sometimes and not present at all other times, and it's all over the board in terms of when it starts and stops and what the timbres are and stuff like that. Although it sounds like we're valuing the track, what we're really valuing is its ability to help us adjudicate what's going on musically on the floor. So that's a lot of stuff in a super short presentation, but the reality is your ability or inability to verbalize what you're seeing and or execute that thing does not diminish your ability to recognize and reward it. So I know Bruce is strip teasing, so he probably is not in the room right now, but I do have a great Bruce Jones story, and he literally said on the tape, I have no idea what the hell you're doing, but I know it's hard and I'm going to reward it. Trust your gut, trust your instinct, inherently understand the nature of the space, and don't be afraid to throw out there, this skill doesn't look like a marching band skill that I understand, but I can show it reward and value, and I can understand that you're attempting an advanced skill and achieving it at a level that it can be understood and provide some sort of value and excellence. In general, I wanted to thank you guys so much. This is going to be a longer question session, mostly because I covered a ton of materials in a lot of different directions, and I'm not entirely certain what was covered in the previous or the future presentations here. But I just wanted to thank you guys so much for your time, and I'm ready to get absolutely destroyed with a barrage of questions across the board.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Wes. If you can, there we go. Wow, Bruce, who knew? It's awesome. Well, the one thought I had, and you're kind of alluding to it, Wes, and maybe we can get you to expand on it. It's just, we're young activity, but it's growing and it's changing, especially from a visual perspective. It's not what it was when we started, which was basically like, coming in like a marching band in the gym. That's gone away. How we move, the skill level that we're moving with, the different techniques, the creativity, and we all embrace that, not just in the visual side, but the whole activity has this palette that we can create the art at a very high creative level, and we're starting to see that. And I know it's only going to grow. So maybe can you talk a little bit more on that specifically, Wes, just as far as the growth and how it impacts the adjudication team and what they need, maybe that lens as you can going forward.
Because it's such a young activity, we've got to be really careful about shoehorning or pigeonholing ourselves. And that's one of the reasons why I was like, hey, I'm an idiot. You can ignore me freely. And that's because every year we're seeing something that changes what the standard is. And we're seeing a different interpretation of what the future of the activity is. So a good example of that would be, and I was trying to think of cornerstones along the way that kind of fit the advanced that I was talking about for each of those skill sets. So, we're going along. We have a pretty good idea of what a soundtrack is like, and then Cleveland comes along with the show about water, and they completely changed how the soundtrack is interpreted and presented throughout the program. We're going along visually. We have a pretty good understanding of visually what we think this activity is, and Mililani comes along and they just completely destroy what that idea is. And likewise, in terms of like stopping and starting a soundtrack, we're going along, and the Rhythm X has a mount station at the back of the floor, and there's a ton of multiplicity of textures and ideas, and it's coming into and it's going out, all over the place and away and all that stuff. I wouldn't be afraid to look at something new and unique within the activity and give it the benefit of the doubt that it will become important or impactful. There's this fear about rewarding things that are different or not inherent in the idiom, but the idiom is so young that you shouldn't be afraid to make a judgment call in that regard, because that will only help propel and grow the activity. And I think musically, as we start to reward smaller groupings of performers, a wider variety of musical textures, a more wind band type approach, we are going to instantly find a lot more people attracted to the activity because of the inherent value in terms of music education. And that's something that's we're kind of at that turning point. Is this going to be a marching arts idiom in a gym, or is it going to be something super sophisticated musically that has more value and reward in that? And it's really, really hard as an adjudicator. I'm not an envious person at all, because you have to make those judgment calls and they're hard to make. But the more that we value what is innovative, and the more we value a more wind band type approach musically, I think that only makes the activity snowball, get bigger and bigger and bigger.
Excellent. I know a couple of things came up in the chat, and I think, we can do a PDF of Wes. We'll arrange that to have a PDF done of your presentation. So thanks for that. And any other questions for Wes?
Wayne had his hand raised.
Yes, Wes, would you go back to the last slide with the electronics and the 3 bars of the green to red? I thought that was really fantastic information, and especially as it applies to how we evaluate those things. And for me, some things I haven't seen before, and I think that would be very helpful for the judges.
Yeah, and so basically, I think that the track's ability to provide time and how consistently it provides time is what inherently determines whether or not it's difficult or not. How various that track is relative to the win score. And I'll actually tell everybody a story in the room. I think Wayne was there, Wayne Markworth was there, and maybe Randy was there. A few years ago, because we were young and we didn't really have any rules in the activity, a sound designer came to me and he said, "Hey, I can just vertically do the Vienna wind sounds from the back of the floor in perfect shape, time, harmony, and texture, and we can just play over the top of that. Do you want to do that?" And I said, "Well, it's not against the rules." And so we did that, and we went to the WGI presentation, and that sound designer and myself decided to try to pass a rule to prevent what we had just done, because we didn't think it was a very ethical thing. So if you look at that rule book and you see that electronics rule that says you can't vertically recreate what's going on in the win score, that was because we did it and no one knew. We actually went to the WGI summer session and we said, "Hey, we're doing this." And people in the room said, "No, you're not." And we literally had to open up the recording and play it for everybody so that they could hear that what they thought they were sampling as wind musicians from the back of the floor was actually the Vienna wind sounds played with perfect shape, time, everything from the back of the floor. We've gotten to the point where our ability to recreate wind sounds, especially in a gym space, you would not recognize that's what's going on. So one of the ways that you value that is when the soundtrack is different, they're saying, "Hey, sample my winds here." And if they're not, I already know just how effective it is at disguising things, because I did it and it meddled in music. So the other thing about the vacancy is it's another opportunity to just sample wind musicians. And also it creates more impact because the highs are so easy to find in terms of the dynamic efforts. the lows need to be explored a lot more in the lesser amount of participants in terms of who's playing what.
That's awesome. That's terrific, Wes. Thank you. Any other comments, questions for Wes? Lots to digest there, huh?
Sorry.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
So Wes, when you're referring to basic, intermediate, and advanced, are you literally referring to the paradigms?
I struggle to, because it's a young activity and because I'm not directly involved in those conversations, I struggle to say, hey, this is what A, this is what open, and this is what world is. And I also understand that we think of it as three different classifications. We think of it as A, open, world, but the reality is that those are scales that blend together. And so I may be choosing to do something very advanced in one of those 9 capstones, but the reality is that I may be overall an A ensemble because of the other decisions I'm making. So that's why I didn't give it a class designator, and I just gave it a scale of green to red, because I thought that was like, hey, green is really comfortable and easy, and red is like scary, alert, alarm. I wanted to take us out of the class paradigm because I didn't want to say that, because I know that I'm probably wrong if I try to say what each class represents or something like that. I'm just telling you that as an educator and designer in that idiom, if I do these things, I know this is easy. And if I do this thing, I know it's hard, so that when you see it, you know where the value is in it. And you guys can make those decisions about what is class appropriate and what the class idioms are. Because I think that's not for a designer to decide. Like, I can't say, hey, this is world class, I'm doing world. But I can say, hey, like, guys, you can try this with people. This is much harder than you think it is. This is much easier than you think it is. This may be counterintuitive because it's not marching band. And in marching band, we all know it's hard. These are the best marching band adjudicators in the country in the room. So we already know it's hard outdoors. What's hard indoors? And how different is that in this space?
Thank you.
Great. Questions for Wes?
Bruce. Hey, Bruce.
Hey, so, and I totally agree with that, and especially how things blend from class to class, and trying to think of it as that you try to create the best artistic, musical, visual program with the tools that you're given. Because honestly, and I've seen this through judging color guards and drums and drum and bugle corps, and you have open class and world class. But the reality is sometimes, and we always have these discussions, and you bump groups up different times, but then there, honestly, in my zillion years or whatever, there are groups who have world-class phrases or moments, but they could still be A or open through the remainder of their time. But honestly, they have set a standard in some aspect, which honestly, as other people see, or, because designers see various things in Broadway or stage, or sometimes even from a competitor that they just elaborate on, and it becomes the most innovative thing the next year. So, so it is tough sometimes when we try to elevate people or say they should even move down because they bit off more than they can choose. So I like that analogy. That was very good. Thanks.
I think that the teacher, counselor, critic thing, I know that that's not necessarily appropriate for this division, but it's something that WGI has really hung its hat on. Knowing, especially knowing the space, it makes it much easier to start to teach educators and designers who have like an A-class ensemble that's kind of struggling. It becomes easier to teach them, hey, you really struggle musically, and you sit in a lot of the stage. And I know that's because it's a lot more comfortable visually to sit in the stage, but you hurt yourself musically. So just think about that going forward. Those kinds of things can be reverse engineered relative to what you're saying, Bruce. Like, we can say, hey, you've made this choice. This choice is advanced for this thing, but I think it's hurting this. So maybe in the future, try to balance those decisions just a little bit more so that you're overall elevating the product that you have.
Totally.
Sorry. be right back. Hey, Jeff.
All right, I'm in charge. Hey, Wes, could you talk just a little bit about the overall effect area in terms of, I always talk about, well, this caption is music general effect, visual general effect, and combined general effect. And I know you do a lot of planning and designing and putting those things together. What are some of your thought processes about that? Do you think in terms of music effect moments, visual effect moments, or are you always thinking about combined moments?
I will say that if I make a tape and I send someone a tape in terms of like outdoor or marching band or something like that, they always go, "You're a visual ensemble judge, stay away from effect." So I will talk about effect as it relates to my profession, but I think that what we think of as an effectual journey is a variety of timbres and textures musically and visually over time that offer some sort of resolution or unifying moment or impactful moment. Beyond that, there's a certain element of the coordinated elements. So like what's going on thematically, what's going on programmatically, what's going on aesthetically, both musically and visually, that help unite all of those things. But I think in terms of effect, if we focus on seeing a variety of textures and timbres over a period of time, and we understand that the value that the aesthetic is adding or taking away, but a lot of times that the effect caption can kind of take care of itself. There's a little bit of this mysticism towards the effect caption, specifically from really analytical people like myself. But if I just step away and I look at what the value system and the reward system for effect is, I know that if I show a lot of different things, and then I have inherent moments that are thematic and programmatic musically and visually, and then I offer resolution, that it will get rewarded 99% of the time. Now, there are outliers in that. And the other thing is that one of the things that makes the effect caption so strange is that understanding is not effect. So looking at something and saying, okay, I don't understand this. How do I find value in it if I don't understand it? Well, then you kind of have to use that analytical approach that I have. I don't understand what this is. I don't understand what it's about. Am I seeing a wide variety of things? Does it feel like the aesthetic is enhancing it both musically and visually? Does it offer me resolution? If so, it is effectual even if I don't understand it. We've only seen a couple of those don't understand shows to this point, but that is generally, as a not effect guy, and like as a visual analysis kind of guy, that's generally how I think about the effect caption. I know, Percy Granger's Immovable Doe is a really good example of this. What makes Percy Granger's Immovable Doe brilliant is not the fact that you're hearing C the whole time. What makes it brilliant is all of the other things that happen on top of it that eventually lead you to the resolution at the end. If you were to watch 5 minutes of just Doe, you've not taken an intellectual or effectual journey. That journey is resultant from all of the other decisions that sit on top of that programmatic idea, and they take us from point A to point B. I think that's more analytical than most effect judges want to approach that activity, but that's how I try to think of effect in general.
Definitely gives a perspective of going into this new season, especially coming off the last two of we just don't know what it's going to be. I mean, I like you all, we did see quite a few things that were highly creative in the virtual setting, highly creative. And again, utilizing a different space. So if nothing else, I'm kind of going in with my eyes and ears wide open, with no expectation. Some of the teams we will recognize, some will be new, but it's so highly exciting. And I remember talking to many of you when we started into this venture, going down the winds route, that was what was so cool about it. It was just like this, this snow that no one had taken a footstep on. And I really have good feelings about it. And, it's exciting to hear people like Wes come in that are actually doing it from the design perspective, to kind of, champion kind of what we already know about the thing. Like the thing is going to explode. It's going to explode creatively. I don't know when that is going to happen. It's already happening in talking to folks and in looking at the what the activity is doing. So I think I speak for all of us that it's just a very exciting time to be part of this. And we just, as adjudicators, need to be open to it in all ways, shapes, and forms. Any other thoughts for Wes? Any questions? So Wes, we will actually figure out a way to get that PDF from you and make it available. That would be terrific. I just found out, as these things tend to go, that Jeff Sactic is not going to be able to join us today, but he promises he's going to put his presentation together and then make it available. He's had some significant car issues. He's not in an accident or anything, but he is on the side of a road as we speak, and he's with AAA and all of that fun stuff. So,
Wes, would
Yes,
you
sir.
like to chat with us some more? That being said,
Yeah, you guys want to talk about staging is staging? I can give my WGICon presentation.
or obviously Wes can just go with these topics. So if any, especially the visual folks, if you have any things that you just like him to talk on, or from his perspective as a designer, or just anything from that, just throw it at him, and as you see, he can go with it.
I got a question. Jeff?
Yes, sir.
Wes, it's Al. Wanted to ask you, I mean, what you just threw at us in 30 minutes was, in my mind, a complete representation of what we're thinking, but also pretty dense. I may have a question or three for you later, just about
Absolutely.
something.
Yes.
You and I connect a couple places. I mean, but I don't want to get in the way of your work. I know how busy you are. Is that going to be an issue if we?
Yes, and I will just advise everybody that my email is at the back of the presentation. I will put my email in the chat. The other thing on that front would be, I'm sure that there are about 3 people in this chat that can attest to this. My brain does not work very well in terms of like response. So if you send me an email, I will respond. It may be 2.5 months, but I will respond. It just takes like I see it. I know it's there. I've got drill writer brain to the max. If there is like that stereotype, that is me. But yeah, send me an email or contact me via Facebook Messenger. Obviously, I'll answer and respond to everything I can. And then obviously, I really trust and value the ethical and moral bearing of everybody in here. So I understand that they won't be unit-specific questions. But beyond that, I will accept, like, I just want to talk about this stuff. I find a lot of value in discussions like this because I think they're meaningful and they help me understand something that I'm trying to understand better. And also, the room in Las Vegas every year gets a little bit bigger and a little bit more vibrant. And we've noticed that circuit participation has just, man, it's gone crazy. We're just a couple of years away from this being one of those things where I won't be able to have conversations like this with you guys and won't be able to have these relationships because the activity will be so far populated that we'll be farther removed from each other. As the percussion activity got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, these conversations got fewer and farther between because there were so many more people involved. Right now, we're still intimate enough that we can have these conversations, and it's really exciting. And I just know that wave is coming as soon as those circuit people start going to championships. This is just going to be a tidal wave, and then I'll just like wave at Albert Lilly as I walk up into the stands, and know that those conversations won't happen again. So reach out as much as you want, and then we'll move from there.